She was a ghost in her own home. But by sunset, the United States would rise to honor her name, while her own family sat in stunned silence. The wipers thudded back and forth against the windshield, barely keeping pace with the spring slush falling thick and slow across the Colorado highway. 3 hours on the road, the last 30 minutes, a crawl through icy curves and low fog. Alexandra Cooper pulled into her parents' driveway just after sunset. Her fingers were still stiff from the steering wheel, her boots leaving a trail of half-melted snow on the polished hardwood floor. Her father didn't look up. He sat at the kitchen counter, glasses perched low on his nose, one finger gliding down a printed RSVP list. He stopped at one name and lingered there, his voice flat, almost an afterthought. "Alex, don't make this weekend about you. Just show up, smile, and let your sister have her moment." That was her welcome. Not a hug. Not a, "How was the drive?" Just a reminder to stay in the background. The scent of lemon polish and roast chicken hung heavy in the air. Her mother, Linda, moved between the oven and the dining table like a woman preparing for a military inspection. Her napkin folds were crisp, her voice sharper. "Your room's upstairs, Alexandra. There's a dress laid out. Please no jeans this time." Alex stood in the doorway for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the familiar arrangement that no longer felt like home. Her presence barely registered. A ghost arriving on cue, expected to be invisible. Nathan, her younger brother, brushed past, with a half-stack of plates. "Hey, Alex. Good timing," he said, offering a quick side hug that didn't pause his stride. She could tell if she'd arrived a day late, no one would have noticed. Upstairs, the hallway echoed with the same curated silence she remembered. Downstairs, the buzz was already building seating plans for tomorrow's ceremony appetizer prep, Emily's speech revisions. The youngest Cooper sibling, Emily, was being promoted at Fort Carson in the morning. The golden girl, the rising officer, the center of every family orbit. Alex. She was the cautionary tale, the dropout, the one who never stayed long enough to unpack. Her father's words lingered in her ears. "Don't be a distraction. Just let Emily shine." So she unpacked her overnight bag in silence. And for tonight, she planned to disappear exactly as expected. It's shocking how easily people can rewrite your life, especially when you're not around to defend it. Alex stood still in the hallway of the old house. Her house, or what used to be. 18 years gone, and yet the scent of cedar still clung to the baseboards like a stubborn ghost. She ran her fingers along the doorframe of the bedroom she once called hers. The room looked the same sort of. Same peach walls, same vintage desk by the window. But the details had been rewritten. On the far shelf, where her Air Force Academy awards used to sit, were now rows of golden plaques inscribed with names that weren't hers. Nathan Roberts, Academic Excellence; Emily Roberts, Junior Cadet of the Year. Each one a quiet declaration. You were never here. Alex's breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, tracing the edge of one award. It was her old frame. Her name had been replaced. Same scuff mark on the bottom left corner. They hadn't even bought new ones. It wasn't just the room. It was her absence, deliberate, curated, sterilized. As if she'd been edited out of her own life. Outside the window, the garden she used to tend had been repurposed. The cherry blossom tree she planted as a teenager was still there, but someone had trimmed it down to a stump. Neat, controlled, like her memory. She sat on the edge of the bed, her old bed, and felt the weight of erasure settle onto her chest. They didn't just forget her. They rewrote her. To anyone looking in from the outside, Alex had washed out. That's what they said, wasn't it? She gave up, dropped out of the Air Force Academy halfway through her second year. Nathan and Emily, the golden children, had soared in her place. And because she wasn't there to explain, no one questioned it. But the truth was never that simple. Alex hadn't quit. She hadn't failed. She had been recruited. A week before midterms, a man with no name and an Air Force badge that didn't scan properly had pulled her from her dorm in the middle of the night. No explanation, no goodbyes, just a simple choice. "Top-tier intelligence," he said. "Your record's clean, your mind's sharp. You speak fluent Arabic and Russian, and more importantly, you know how to disappear. We need you to do that. She did, for 18 years. While Nathan was earning medals for ROTC and Emily was waving at local parades in uniform, Alex was in safe houses with no windows transmitting signals no one would ever trace back to her. She had listened to whispers through cracked radios in war zones. She had memorized satellite paths by heart. She had done things that never made it to headlines because they were never meant to. But now, standing in her old room, none of that mattered. Not to her mother, who had once said, "Emily reminds me of the daughter I always hoped for." Not to her father, who used to say Alex was too intense for her own good. And certainly not to the neighbors who had stopped asking about her after year 5. They believed she had failed. And because no one corrected them, it had become fact. People forget how fragile the truth is, how silence lets fiction grow teeth. She wandered into the living room next. The family wall was packed pictures of barbecues, promotions, and wedding portraits. Emily and Nathan are in full dress uniform. Her parents were at a military ball. There were no gaps, no spaces for someone like her. It was strange, almost laughable. Somewhere in a locked room in D.C., her face was on a black file labeled Non-Citizen Contact High-Value Asset. She had a clearance level that outranked most Pentagon aides, but in this house she didn't exist. That night she didn't sleep. She sat in her car out front until dawn broke, watching as the front porch light flickered off, watching as her father stepped outside to fetch the paper, pausing to sip his coffee like he always had. He didn't look around, didn't wonder who might be parked outside. 18 years gone, and the world moved on like she'd never touched it. Alex rested her head on the steering wheel. There was no rage, no dramatic revelation, just a bitter understanding. You disappear long enough and people don't just forget you, they replace you. The text came at 10:42 p.m., just as Alex was lying down the glow of the hallway, seeping in through the gap beneath her old bedroom door. She didn't even need to open it. She already knew the tone. Just a reminder. Please don't wear anything weird tomorrow, nothing flashy. Uniforms aren't required. No greeting. No, thanks for coming or can't wait to see you. Just instructions. That was Emily, always managing, always curating. Alex let the phone screen dim and eventually fade to black without responding. Over the years in war rooms and field briefings, she'd learned that silence often carried more precision than words. You didn't need to raise your voice to be heard, especially if your presence alone said more than anyone expected. Downstairs, the familiar murmur of her family hummed through the floorboards. Her father's voice was steady going over the program again. Her mother's footsteps passed in measured bursts, setting out the silverware, prepping place cards, folding cocktail napkins into tight, perfect triangles. Nathan's laugh rumbled faintly from the basement. Emily wouldn't arrive until early morning. She was staying on base to revise her remarks with the colonel. Even in her absence, she was the gravitational pull of every conversation. Alex sat up in bed, letting her eyes scan the room she hadn't really lived in for almost 20 years. The lacrosse trophies were still there, faded from sun and time. So was the photograph of her in that Air Force Academy sweatshirt, her hair bleached gold by that first Colorado summer. But everything else had been stripped or replaced. The wall that used to hold her certificate of completion from her first Black Ops rotation, gone. Now a shadow of its frame remained, replaced by Emily's Officer of the Year plaque. The parts of her life that didn't fit the family narrative had been boxed away, forgotten. But this time, she wasn't angry. Not anymore. She could have packed it all in, driven back to Denver that same night, disappeared like she always did. That would have been easier, cleaner. No tension, no sidelong glances, no hovering at the edge of family photos trying to find where she belonged. But she wasn't leaving. Not this time. She reached for her travel folder, the one she'd brought out of storage a few months ago. It held almost nothing: a folded field memo, a single commendation letter, a blurry photo of her strike team, half the faces redacted. It wasn't a resume. It wasn't even proof. But it was hers. She didn't need validation. She needed something simpler to be present. That realization settled over her quietly, not as defiance, but as clarity. Morning came early. Her mother knocked once before cracking the door open. "I brought you coffee," Linda said, setting a mug on the desk. "Oh, and I ironed the blouse for you. It's the beige one. Safe color. Safe. Predictable. Bland." Alex nodded, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you." She didn't mention that she'd already chosen her own outfit. She'd wear the blouse fine, but she would pair it with her own boots. The ones from Kandahar. Clean polished, but worn just enough to carry stories no one at the ceremony would dare ask. Downstairs, the household was already in motion. Rachel, no. Emily had arrived dressed impeccably in full uniform. Even over breakfast, she held herself like a headline. Her posture impossibly straight, her phone in one hand, cross-checking times with someone named Con Ramsey. Their mother fluttered around her holding out a ceramic mug like a prop assistant on a set. George was scanning his printed program again. Alex poured herself coffee and stood quietly at the far end of the counter. Neither outside nor in. "Morning, Alex," Emily said flatly, without looking up. "We need to be out the door by 7:15 sharp. You're riding with Mom. Please don't be late." "I won't be," Alex said, voice calm. Emily nodded once before resuming her text. It would have been so easy to call her out, to say something sharp, something that cut. But Alex didn't. Not because she didn't have the words, but because she didn't need to use them. She was no longer trying to prove anything. She just wanted to occupy her own space fully, quietly, and completely. As they loaded into their separate cars, her mother turned back toward Alex and gave her a once-over. "You look nice," she said softly. "Very appropriate." Alex smiled faintly. "Thanks, Mom." They drove in silence toward the base. Outside, the mountains rose gently into a soft blue sky, wildflowers blooming along the airfield fencing. The world kept moving unbothered by ceremony. At the checkpoint, her mother flashed her retired teacher's ID and smiled like it was a parent-teacher conference. The guard didn't blink. As they approached the event hall, Alex caught her reflection in the glass. For the first time in years, she didn't look for a shadow behind her. She stood straight, centered, and still. She wasn't here to disappear. She was here to be seen. When truth finally walks in, it doesn't shout. It simply stands and lets the silence do the rest. The ceremony was held in a hall large enough to echo. Rows of starched uniforms, glinting medals, polished shoes. Proud families filled the seats, smiling, whispering, clutching their programs like keepsakes. Alex sat near the back. Her name tag didn't read colonel or director. Just Alexandra Cooper. Family. Plain. Civilian. Forgettable. No one offered her a better seat. Not even her parents, who sat proudly in the front row beside Emily, were straight-backed and glowing. They hadn't noticed Alex walk in. Or maybe they had and chose not to react. Either way, it didn't matter. Alex was used to being invisible. She smoothed the dark crease of her suit, clean, simple, but impeccable. Years of intel briefings and off-the-grid operations had taught her the art of blending in. But today, the stillness she wore wasn't camouflage. It was patience. The master of ceremonies welcomed the guests, reading through the list of names and ranks. Words blurred together in the air, titles and designations that once might have meant something to her. Now they just felt like clutter. Then came Emily. Her sister stepped up to the podium, draped in Air Force blues, her medals proudly catching the stage lights. She looked poised, maybe even presidential. Alex watched as Emily adjusted the microphone. Her voice rang clear. "I want to thank everyone who made today possible," she began. "My mentors, my squadron, and especially my family, my mom, my dad, Nathan." She paused, eyes flickering toward the crowd. "And of course, Alexandra," she added quickly like an afterthought. "My older sister, wherever she is." A few polite chuckles. Her parents smiled but didn't look back. Alex didn't react. No bitterness, no eye roll, not even a sigh. That version of Alex Ghost in Emily's speech wasn't her. That version was a placeholder, a myth built from absence, But the woman sitting here now, the one who had seen war zones and wiretaps, watched satellites track down threats before they made the evening news, that woman was real. And she was waiting. Emily wrapped her speech with a triumphant grin. The applause was generous, a standing ovation from the front rows. She returned to her seat, head held high. Then the room shifted. A man in a formal uniform rose from the first reserved row. Silver clusters lined his shoulders. His presence quieted the back rows. People leaned forward instinctively. His voice when he spoke was low and deliberate. "We have one final acknowledgement today." Silence fell like a curtain. "This is not on the program," he continued, "but it should have been." Alex's eyes stayed on the podium, steady. The officer turned slightly toward the crowd. "For the past 18 years, this individual has served not in front of the cameras, but behind the shadows, where silence is standard and recognition is rare." People began whispering. He went on. "She has saved lives no one knew were in danger. Built networks no one will ever see. Sacrificed holidays' safety, even her own name." A pause. "Director Alexandra Cooper," he said, turning fully now. "On behalf of the United States Intelligence Command, thank you for your years of service." You could hear the air leave the room. Emily froze, her smile shattering mid-expression. Her hands clenched in her lap. Their parents turned slowly in their chairs, blinking, stunned. Alex stood. No drama, no victory grin. She simply rose from her chair, buttoned her blazer, and gave a small, respectful nod. The commander returned it. No applause. Not yet. Just stunned silence. And then, one by one, people began to stand not in excitement, but in awe. Some clapped slowly. Others just watched. Emily remained seated. Her face was unreadable, but her hands trembled. Alex didn't look at her. She walked down the aisle, calmly accepting the simple certificate the officer handed her. Nothing flashy. Just acknowledgement. Recognition. She didn't need to say a word. Because when truth finally walks into the room, it doesn't need to scream to be heard. It only needs to stand and be seen. Recognition doesn't always arrive from the place you've longed for, but when it does come, it finds you standing. The reception buzzed with the soft hum of formal small-talk glassware clinking and polished shoes brushing against parquet flooring. Emily stood near the center of the room, surrounded by officers, family, and friends. Her voice bright, her posture perfect. Alex stayed to the side, a quiet silhouette near the back like she had been all day. Her name, Director Alexandra Cooper, still hung in the air, echoing in the stunned expressions of those who'd just learned she hadn't disappeared, hadn't failed. She had risen in silence. Yet the room, as rooms often do, had shifted back into comfort. The spotlight was already drifting. Emily had recovered her social grace, laughing too loudly. Their mother sipped wine, delicately avoiding Alex's presence. Their father, George, had spoken no more than 3 words to her since the ceremony. "You never said." But now the air changed again. A new hush rippled across the room as a figure entered, deliberate, upright, dignified, despite the weight of age. The medals on his chest weren't polished for show. They were lived in, earned, and recognized by all. A retired general. His arrival cut through the chatter like a blade through ribbon. Conversations died mid-sentence. Younger officers straightened instinctively out of habit and respect. He didn't head for the center of the room or the high table. He walked directly to Alex. "Director Cooper," he said loud enough for the room to hear, "we owe you more than words could carry." The pause that followed felt like a vacuum. Alex turned to face him, measured and still. She didn't flinch, didn't bow, just met his eyes and nodded one professional to another. The general took her hand, both of his enveloping hers. "Some of us remember. Not the headlines, not the parades, but the nights we slept because you stayed awake." It was the kind of praise that wasn't meant to impress a crowd. It was meant to last a lifetime. Emily stood, frozen wine glass in hand, blinking, as if the scene might dissolve if she stared hard enough. The man who had just spoken her name with such reverence, he wasn't one of her connections. He wasn't on her list of endorsements. He didn't even glance at her. And George, her father, looked at Alex like he was seeing her for the very first time. Not just as the girl who didn't come home, not the sister who was too intense or too quiet, but someone he had never truly known. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He lowered his eyes. All across the room, small whispers began to circulate. Names, operations, places. Words like covert, top-tier clearance, and black level trickled from corner to corner. A quiet tide of realization swept through the crowd. Someone clapped. Just one at first, a woman in a navy dress uniform. Then another somewhere near the back. The sound was hesitant, uncertain. Until it wasn't. Soon it built layer by layer, hand by hand, into a swell. For the first time, applause. For her. Not the uniform she didn't wear. Not the medals she never showed. But for her. Alex didn't smile. Not quite. But something in her shoulders softened. Not with pride, not even with relief. Just stillness, like the ache of carrying weight you'd almost forgotten was there and realizing someone else just saw it. The general leaned in slightly, his voice lower now. "We haven't forgotten what you gave up, even if they did." Alex nodded once more. "Thank you, sir." He returned the gesture, then stepped back, letting the room adjust. Letting the crowd absorb what had just happened. Emily didn't move. Her hands trembled faintly, still gripping the wine glass. Her mouth parted in a forced, brittle smile. Her world, where she had been the star, the symbol, the daughter who stayed, had tilted. Not violently, not loudly, just enough to feel it break underfoot. George slowly stepped toward Alex. Not confident, not proud, just quiet. "Why didn't you tell us?" he asked, voice low. "All these years." Alex looked at him, not angry, not cold. Simply clear. "Would you have believed me?" He didn't answer. Because they both knew the truth. Recognition doesn't always come from the ones who raised you or the ones who claim to love you loudest. Sometimes it comes from a stranger who remembers what the silence cost, who remembers the work done in shadows not for glory, but because someone had to do it. That night, Alex didn't give a speech. She didn't take center stage. She didn't correct anyone who still misunderstood the years they'd written her out of. She simply stayed, standing, still seen. And this time they didn't look away. Sometimes you don't need to explain yourself, you just need to stop hiding. The house was quiet again. Alex had returned home hours after the ceremony ended, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floors as she entered. She didn't turn on the lights right away. She liked the dusk, the silence, the after of everything. The day had passed like a slow tide, moving from disbelief to applause, from stares to nods, from distance to something almost like recognition. And now, stillness. She set her keys on the table and shrugged off her jacket. It smelled faintly of perfume and old wood polish from the reception hall. Her phone buzzed. She didn't rush to check it. Old instincts. In her line of work, messages were rarely casual. But this one was different. A simple text. From her mother. "Your father said he's proud of you today." That was all. Not a paragraph, not an apology wrapped in half-truths. Just that one sentence, direct and disarming. Alex read it 3 times. Her chest didn't swell, it didn't ache, it just shifted. The phone buzzed again. Another message. This one is from Emily. "Are you free Friday night, just the 2 of us?" "Dinner." Alex stared at the screen. 1,000 possible replies flickered through her mind. 1,000 old memories. 1,000 versions of her sister, the golden girl, the perfectionist, the unknowing rival. But tonight, none of them seemed to matter. She typed 2 words. "I'm free," and sent it. No hesitation. She set the phone down on the counter and walked into the hallway. Her footsteps felt softer than they used to. Not because the house had changed, because she had. For years, Alex had returned to this space like a ghost. She dropped her bag by the door, removing her shoes, keeping everything hidden. Routine and containment always. Her life, her real life, had been stuffed into a weatherproof lockbox under the floorboards in her bedroom closet. a place no one ever looked, a place even she avoided, not out of fear, out of habit. Tonight, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, she opened the closet door without thinking, pulled out the box, laid it on her desk. It was heavier than she remembered. Metal corners scratched the combination dial still stiff from lack of use. She turned it slowly. 3, 7, 2, 1. A quiet click, then stillness. She lifted the lid. Inside were the pages of a life almost no one knew existed. Copies of black-banded clearance orders, mission briefs labeled redacted, a photograph of her standing in front of a U.S. embassy in Eastern Europe, face half-shadowed expression, unreadable. Her old ID barely even a name, just a number and a rank. Alex didn't sort through the files, didn't flip through the evidence of the person she had been when no one was watching. She simply left the box open, left it on the desk, in the light, not as a warning, not as an invitation, but as a quiet fact. She had nothing left to hide. For years she had lived in compartments, family, in one work, in another self, somewhere too deep to define. It had been safer that way, cleaner, simpler. But safety wasn't freedom, and silence wasn't peace. That night she made herself a simple dinner, eggs, toast, and a glass of water. She sat by the window and watched the porch light flicker on as dusk deepened into night. The world didn't change, but something inside her had. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She wasn't the forgotten daughter, the cautionary tale, the rumor at the edge of someone else's story. She was Alexandra Cooper, and if people wanted to know what that name meant, they could come ask. Not everything needed to be told. Not everything could. But the difference now was, she no longer needed to prove anything. The box stayed on the desk, its contents visible, undeniable. Not shouted, just there. Like her. The office in Denver was small, but filled with light. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the skyline, and a steady hum of analysts moved quietly between cubicles, clutching coffee mugs and briefing folders. No medals on the walls, no portraits. Just a whiteboard filled with strategy notes and a pinned quote near the exit. Integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. Alex didn't need a title anymore. Her ID badge read simply, A. Cooper, Strategic Programs Lead. That was enough. Her new role wasn't about command or recognition. It was about shaping those who would one day carry responsibilities she knew intimately, the invisible weight of quiet service, of classified choices made far from applause. She mentored a cohort of young analysts, brilliant, fast-thinking minds who had never served a day in uniform, but were eager to understand how the world worked beneath the headlines. She didn't teach them how to impress or how to climb. She taught them how to stay steady when no one said thank you, how to spot the silence in a room and read it, how to serve with spine, not ego. They listened more than she expected. Sometimes one would linger after a session. "Why haven't I seen your name on anything?" a young man asked her once, notebook half closed in his lap. Alex just smiled. "You won't," she replied. "And that's kind of the point." A few months into her new rhythm, a message landed in her inbox. Subject line: Keynote Opportunity, Regional Security Leadership Conference. She almost clicked delete. Public speaking had never been her arena. She was the one behind the curtain, the voice in the brief, the final edit before submission. But something about the timing gave her pause. The conference theme: Leadership Beyond Visibility. That night she stood in her apartment looking at her own reflection in the microwave door, holding the invitation in one hand. She didn't ask for permission. She accepted. The conference was held in a converted library hall near Colorado Springs, stone walls, vaulted ceilings, glass skylights overhead. Rows of chairs filled with policy directors, military officers, university fellows. She recognized a few faces from briefing rooms years ago. None of them recognized her. She wore simple black. No insignia, no heels, no PowerPoint slides. Just her. As she waited backstage, she glanced toward the second row. Emily sat there uniformed, but relaxed, her hair neatly pulled back, hands folded in her lap. She'd texted a few days earlier. "Heard you're speaking. I'd love to come if that's okay." Alex hadn't responded right away, but the answer was always yes. Now watching her sister seated front and center, no clipboard, no checklist, no script, something inside Alex settled. This time, Emily wasn't there to manage. She was there to listen. Alex stepped onto the stage and stood quietly for a moment. No one reached for their phones, no camera flashes, just stillness. She began with a story not about rank, not about service medals or missions, but about the first time she realized she could disappear from her own life and no one would notice. "I've served for almost 2 decades," she said evenly. "Most of that time, no one could say my name in a room. Not out loud. Not in any document that wasn't burned an hour later." She paused, scanning the faces. "I was taught that the mission mattered more than the recognition, that silence was part of the job. And for the most part it was." She let the next sentence sit for a beat longer. "But silence has a cost. It can protect you, but it can also keep you apart." There were nods in the crowd now, eyes shifting. She spoke of choices made in isolation, of watching her siblings rise, while she stayed behind layers of clearance. She spoke of how families rewrite stories when they don't know the full truth and how sometimes you let them. "Not all leadership is loud," she said quietly. "Some of it lives in the pauses, the unanswered messages, the presence that doesn't need to announce itself." She ended with no crescendo. "Just a truth. For years I believed you had to be seen to matter. But I've learned there is dignity in quiet work, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay the course, especially when nobody's watching." Applause came slowly at first, not thunderous, but warm, real. Alex nodded once and stepped down. Emily waited in the hallway just outside the stage door. "That was—" she began, but couldn't quite finish. Alex smiled. "Different from your change of command speeches, huh?" Emily laughed softly. "Yeah, but more honest." She handed Alex a card. Inside, in Emily's neat handwriting, "For the sister who showed me what real leadership looks like." No signature, no rank, just sister. And this time that was everything. The driveway hadn't changed. Same loose gravel that crunched under her boots. Same porch light already glowing in the late evening, casting warm rectangles onto the front steps. But as Alexandra Cooper stepped out of her car, something in her chest felt lighter. Not like arrival, more like return. Inside, laughter was already spilling from the kitchen. Her mother's voice floated out high and musical. Nathan was cracking a joke about a grill disaster from last summer. Emily's lower, steadier laugh followed close behind. No place cards, no schedule taped to the fridge, just family. Linda opened the door before Alex could knock. "You made it," she said, not out of politeness, but with a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "We're already plating the food. Come in, come in." Alex stepped into the house she'd once tried so hard not to haunt. This time she didn't feel like a ghost. The table was full. Roast chicken, garlic potatoes, crusty bread that looked suspiciously like one of Nathan's attempts at baking. A neighbor sat near the end, chatting with George about backyard tomatoes. Nathan's wife, Carly, balanced a wine glass and a sleeping toddler. Emily stood near the sink towel draped over one shoulder, hair pulled back casually. She turned and grinned. "You're sitting in the middle tonight, Director?" Alex laughed. "I'm off duty." "Even better. You can pass the bread." Dinner was noisy in the best way, spoons clinking, overlapping stories, the kind of chaos that no longer felt like a stage play. No one corrected anyone. No one filtered themselves. The family had somehow loosened, not broken, not reinvented, but softened. When the dishes were cleared, Nathan pulled out an old family album, weathered and dusty, from the hall closet. They flipped through birthdays, summer barbecues, crooked Christmas trees. There were gaps, of course. Entire years where Alex wasn't in the photos, out of frame or away or erased. But this time, nobody skimmed past them. Emily paused at one shot, faded and off-center. Alex was there just barely. Half a smile at the edge of the frame. "We'll take a new one." Emily said, tapping the corner of the page. Everyone in the middle this time. Alex didn't say anything, but the warmth in her throat said enough. Later in the backyard, the summer dusk had turned lavender and the stars blinked into view one by one. Fireflies hovered like punctuation in the dark. George came out holding a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. He offered one to Alex without speaking. For a while they just stood there watching the sky. Then softly he said, "I should have asked more questions." Alex looked over. Her father wasn't avoiding her gaze anymore. "I thought I knew who you were," he continued. "You were always so quiet about it all." She took a sip. "That was the job." He nodded. "Still, I should have seen more." There wasn't a perfect reply, but she didn't need one. After a few beats, George raised his glass. Not dramatically, just enough. "To Alex," he said, turning toward her. "To those who show up even when it's easier to walk away." Before she left that night, Emily handed her a small box, no ribbon, just folded neatly. "Open it when you get home," she said, tone light but eyes steady. Back in her apartment under the soft hum of the fridge and city lights outside her window, Alex peeled it open. Inside was a keychain brushed metal simple engraving, "Sister, Leader, Home." She closed her fingers around it and held it in her palm for a long time. The next morning, Alex pinned a sticky note to her fridge. 3 words scribbled in blue ink. "There's room now." She didn't mean in the house, or at the table. She meant in the story, her story. The one that didn't need a spotlight. The one that had always mattered, even when no one was watching. And if there was room for her, there was room for others too, for the quiet ones, the late bloomers, the misunderstood, the ones who weren't always in the picture. There was room for all of them. Sometimes you don't need the table to be rebuilt. You just need someone to scoot over and say, "Here, this seat's for you."